really quite readable. The idea of HTML is to be, human readable to define these websites, as well as JavaScript. And so as we kind of interact with the page on the right, we can see that as a mouse clicks on this particular image, it executes that change image code and changes the picture. And again, if there's anything that's hosted on the website, such as, let's go and find a image of LabView. I'm going to right click and select copy image location. Go back to my code here, and I can replace this image source with my LabView image. See result. And now notice when I click, it changes to that LabView image. Okay? So that's about the kind of fastest introduction you could possibly get to HTML and JavaScript. Obviously, there's a lot more powerful things that it can do. And we'll see a couple of those in a moment. Let's get our PowerPoint back up and running. There we go. Great. Okay. So, we've added a couple more technologies now to our introductory roadmap here. We've added HTML and JavaScript over there on the left. Now, you notice that I had to actually, you notice that, I guess it wasn't so clear in that example, but for the website to actually pull new data, or we saw this in the URL that we created for our web service. So I had a query string where I sent it, A equals 5 and B equals 6 and give me the result. To get a new result, I would have to refresh that page with a new query string, right? So that's not typically how websites are used. You shouldn't have to be hitting refresh every time you want your web service to go out and get new data, right? The kind of web applications that we're all used to are very interactive, and they're doing a lot of things in the background as you have the page open. And so that concept is actually called AJAX. It's asynchronous JavaScript and XML. And really all that means is that your code behind your JavaScript is continuously going back and pulling some kind of new data. And that's really kind of the basic part of the concept. And so let's take a look at an example that we've created in LabView that does exactly this. Okay, so, oops. All right, so I'm going to open up a new demo here. Actually, we'll go with this one right here. Okay. So I've got a web service that I've called Web Client that's already created. It's got a web resource VI called add2. And I'm going to start my service so that it's running in the background. And I've also have some public content here. And inside there is a subfolder for JS for my JavaScript content and also for my HTML content. So let's take a look at what these files actually look like. And so I'll open up my notepad to look at home.html, which was the name of my file. And okay, let's zoom in a couple more times. So that was okay. So how's that looking? Is that a little bit better over there? Can you guys see the text? I'll zoom in a little bit more. Is the text visible at the back? Somewhat? No? No. Okay, I'm getting no's. Okay, let's keep it going here. I don't have a num on my laptop keyboard, so I'm not able to use the shortcut. Okay, let's wait one more time for posterity. Okay, so what we're doing inside this code here, and so this is our HTML script, and it's actually fairly simple. And again, on that community page, a lot of these are hosted there. So it's doing a couple things. It's loading some jQuery JavaScript from Google APIs, and it's loading a JS/home.js. That's actually the one that we created. So my HTML page is essentially loading these different kinds of JavaScript libraries that I'm going to use inside. And then after that, it's really just describing the look of my website. It's got a title. It has a table that contains a couple fields. So I noticed that one was called first number with an input field, second number with an input field and a result, and then it's got a button that's called submit button. So let's see what that looks like on the web page so we can kind of map these two concepts together. So again, just like I did with my VI, I can right-click and say show public URL, very easy, copy URL, and then I can plug that into a web page. So there's my super fancy web page that's got a bit of HTML that describes these things. Now, let's go back and actually look at the JavaScript file that was loaded. So home.js. Now again, this has the functionality of my web page. And in fact, it's actually quite simple. What it's doing is it has a function called update, and I have this submit button.click. What that means is I've actually given my button, which we saw on my page here, this one's called submit. So I can see in my HTML, on the front of the website it's called submit, but in fact in the code behind I gave it an ID called submit button. And again, because I said JavaScript and HTML can work together and they know about each other's defined variables. And so in my JavaScript code, I can access the value of submit button. And so I'm referencing it here, and if it gets clicked, then I'm going to call this function called update. And update is defined here. So the logic that's going to execute when update gets called is this exactly here. This part you can ignore because that was for debugging. But essentially what it's going to do is it's going to do the same thing that we did in the past. We're just putting together a URL, which is a web address with a query string at the end. And so our URL starts off as HTTP with my IP address of my machine, the port as before, web client, which is the name of my web service, add to, which is the name of my function. We can close these guys, right? So this all corresponds, we'll close that demo as well. So it all corresponds to what I have in my LabView code. Web client and add to is the name of my function. So this is really just a string. If it's between quotation marks, it's a string. And then I'm setting up that query address. And so it takes the value of first number. So what's first number? That was defined in our HTML, right? We had a field called first number, and we gave it an ID. Second number, we gave it an ID. That's all the same stuff that we've got, first number, second number, in our web page. And in my JavaScript, I am taking that value and the value of second number, appending it to my whole string, and then I'm passing it as something called a JSON, as JSON text. So JSON is you could think of it as a descriptive format for sending web text. And it's kind of like, you can almost think of it also as like a structure in C. It's got kind of defined fields in it, or even like a TDMS file, where it's got fields, TDMS files, which have metadata fields assigned to them. So you can address different fields of a JSON object very easily, and it's just a format in which you pass web data in. In fact, I think I was looking at the Web3 tutorials tutorial on here as well. So here's an example of a JSON text that's sent. So it can associate based on IDs and kind of keywords the actual value that's sitting behind it. And so it's a little bit more user-friendly than just pure XML, if you're familiar with that. But essentially it's kind of a structured notation of sending data across the web. So we are sending that as a JSON text to our URL, and then we are getting data. We are getting data back from that query. And if you look at, so let's actually run this, see if it works. So what happens to my, and actually I can load this VI, and I should see so I can see as it's running, I can see on the front panel these values getting passed back. So I can see that the JSON response, which I put on my front panel to make it easier for me to understand, is 9 here. And so let's take a look at the source code of my add to. Oops. So what it's doing in my source code is it's waiting on, let's put my context help closer here so we can see what's going on. So I've got this read from data VI, which is accepting my request, and it's handling, again, we're sending it as JSON data, so we're able to kind of index the different values in the string using keys. And so that's how I'm able to parse out the different values, add them together, and then use this flatten to JSON string to send an actual response, which we were able to see on the front panel as well. Okay. And then in this particular example, we were clicking submit every time we wanted to submit our two string parameters back to our web service running in LabView. We can instead have our website automatically send this periodically, and we can control how often by changing the code as such. So instead, we're actually setting an interval of 500 milliseconds, and we are updating first number and second number on update of that field. So again, HTML is very smart. It knows, if a user has entered a new value into that field, it's got these nice kind of built-in methods that say on update, on click. So it already implements a lot of user interaction into the code as well that you can take advantage of. And so if I hit save, hopefully everything works. I can go back to my website and should be updating every few seconds, which doesn't seem to be working. Let's see. Not this time. Doesn't feel like it. I was getting those pop-ups before. It's possible that my home.js might not be the same one that's on disk. from that example right now. But that's essentially how you would implement it. The other thing is that while it didn't work this time, so you'll just have to believe me, is that I can update my JavaScript file. Oh, I know what the problem is. The problem is that we didn't actually refresh the page. There we go. So now it's updating automatically. So while I didn't have to restart my web service, so what did I do there, right? I didn't change the LabView code. I changed the JavaScript code, and I hit save. And so to actually use that latest version of the JavaScript code, I would have to reload the web page. That's what we didn't do. But I didn't have to stop the web service. Again, the web service continues to be running. It's just the part that's handling the interaction from the web client to LabView. So that can continue running because I hadn't changed any of my LabView code. To change the LabView code, I would have to stop the web service, edit my code, save it, rerun the web service. However, everything from the web service and out to the web, so my JavaScript code, my HTML code, that gets loaded on reload of the web page. So I can make edits there without touching the LabView stuff, so that you can kind of understand there's a split between there's the split between the dependencies there. Okay. What kind of questions does anyone have thus far? Any questions? Yes.
Is it the local server or is it really organized? Meaning if I key in this on my phone now.
Yes, this will work. Yeah.
Then if you want to link a local server within Italian, let's say if I'm doing a don't want people from outside.
Right. Yeah. So the way to do that, first there's let's see. So there's a couple ways that you can control it based on ports that are only open on a subnet. So again, we have the IP address, but we also have the ports. You can control which ports are open to just a subnet. So it takes just a bit of networking configuration to set that up first, versus ports that are open to the external network. And then after that, you can implement, so HTTPS is the secure version of HTTP. And there's a lot of checks that we can put inside our HTML code to validate and authenticate different users. So you might want to implement authentication, for example, that you're going to go back and check with your database a password and username before you let anyone actually make, kind of open up a connection to that code that's going on.
If you don't publish your address, nobody knows.
Sure, but it can be found, right? It can be sniffed out. If it's out there, it can be sniffed.
Not that easy.
Not easily, but by bots. Not by a human, but by a bot. Yeah. So there's bots out there that are looking for open ports and open addresses to hack into different networks. So, and based on your IP address, people can know pretty quickly what company you're at, where you are in the world, and so it's again, the question of security is a huge topic when going through this. So by default, web services are published externally. So there's a checkbox that you can do to keep it local also. Yes, question over here.
Just you're showing us the HTML code, right?
Mm-hmm.
As well as there are two libraries you I don't know what is the reasoning of that two code, two lines.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a great question. In fact, you're preempting our next topic, which is calling different libraries. So the jQuery library we were calling so that we can access those JavaScript calls. So to run a JavaScript and use the JSON format, we were importing the jQuery library. Yeah.
Do you have to go for the Google to include that particular right? Then normally, what do you have to go get it from the Google method?
It doesn't have to be, that's a great question. So, and let me just go to that part of the script so we're all on the same page here. So our next topic actually is about calling different libraries. And you can call libraries that are local or call ones that are on the web. And so in this example, we were using a jQuery library that's hosted on Google APIs. However, we can take that library, copy it locally so that we don't have to be connecting to that, in the future, And then in the next example, what we'll see is using Google Graph libraries. So there's a huge amount of different kinds of web functions that you can use alongside your LabView code. By the way, I know I started late, but I want to keep on time. It's 12:25. What time should I be finishing?
Within 10 minutes?
Within 10 minutes. Perfect. All right. Okay, so JavaScript libraries is in fact our next topic. So very good call on pointing that out. And so I'll show you an additional example here of where we're, let's see, so let me just look ahead really quickly at the slides. There's also a cloud example and some next steps. So we could probably get through both of these examples in the next 10 minutes really easily. So in this upcoming example, we're actually going to load a graph from Google. And we'll just look at the code kind of pretty quickly because we don't want to spend time analyzing it in detail since you could do this at your desk. But I'll cover some of the key notions of what's happening, and then we can look at the cloud example also. So I'm going to load the next demo here. And close this one. Okay. So inside this web service, I have a very simple method VI that essentially just generates a random data waveform. So that's about all it's doing there. But this is a web VI, so this is published as can be published as a JSON. This data can be published as a JSON object to the web. And then let's take a look at my public content. I've got let's start my web service. It's already started. And we'll take a look at initial.html and see what it's doing.
Maksudnya PMP campur dengan kita buat dalam kelas pemadaman kelas PMP campur bagi dua. So dia tak bagi tahu.
There it is. Okay, so it took a moment there to get up and running. Okay, so in fact, when you look at my LabView project, right, there's actually very little that's happening in LabView right now. This, replace random with something that talks to a DAC card that actually writes data to a file, that would make a lot of sense. But really, that's just the piece that's talking to the hardware. Everything else that actually displays the data in a graph on a web page and loads that graph is actually all happening in HTML. So you can think of, when you're thinking about what happens in which parts of the code, what should be implemented in LabView versus JavaScript and HTML. Think of LabView as the layer all to your hardware that performs all the analysis, that talks to your LabView libraries, all the stuff that you use LabView for today. And then JavaScript and HTML is everything that's described on the website. And so something like a graph is a typical object that web developers use, and so in fact there's free hosted graphs that are out there that you can implement in your VIs as well. And so if we take a look at this code, the HTML is very simple because you take one look at it and you can tell that there's not a lot of HTML code describing this. It's very simple. So really all it is it's loading the Google JavaScript API loadgraph.js, which is our function, and it's displaying a chart. And then loadgraph.js is where the magic happens, and it's inside here that we're actually getting our data from our LabView VI. And in this version, rather than using the URL with the query as a JSON object, we actually did an XML HTTP. So this shows a little bit of the difference between XML and JSON objects. XML is a little bit more level. You can see that there's a lot more kind of parsing that on the return value that has to happen. So that's why we recommend using JSON format, because it's a little bit more high level. It kind of wraps the data in this structure that's easier to access different fields of the structure. But essentially what this code is doing is it's loading a graph, and then it's requesting data from our web VI that was our randoms. We can find that in here. That's our graph service.random VI, and it's parsing what is returned and loading it to the graph. Okay. Now the cloud example, I'll just show very briefly, in fact uses a data server, a free data server in the cloud, and it already has some existing data in it, so we're actually pulling that. So sparkdata.html is defined here, which is essentially pulling data that exists in the cloud and loading it onto a site, and we'll just see what that looks like real quick for posterity. Start that, show the URL, copy it, look at it inside. So very simple, kind of a historian of data. Lets us, you could see how this might be useful for anything that's a logging application that's collecting a lot of data over time. So right now it's pulling most of its data just from a existing server. So if you look at our LabView code, in fact there's really nothing in it. There's no startup VIs, there's only that HTML file because it's really doing everything on the web. But what might be very useful for us is to actually write data from LabView to one of these cloud servers. And to do this, we're using HTTP functions inside LabView to write, you might be acquiring from a DAC device that's running remotely, storing some of that on disk and writing it through HTTP or FTP servers to a cloud location. And then the HTML script really is just reading from that cloud. So there's kind of another layer of separation, which is where the data is stored on the cloud server, and then which is kind of this just used to house the data, so that the node can publish to the cloud, and then clients can attach to the cloud to read and display it. So that actually concludes the presentation. And again, this was meant to be an introduction to a lot of these concepts, and and kind of get you familiar with some of the technologies so that this seems less daunting. There's a whole business around writing great web applications, and certainly there's also a lot of partners that you could hire to create great web applications. But for a lot of simple use cases, it's not too hard to be developing these yourselves, and especially because LabView Web Services can handle that publishing part of it and actually handle all the layer down to your actual instrumentation. So with that, I recommend checking the community for these examples and getting familiar with yourself. Google around to get more familiar. There's tons of free tutorials out there. And thank you for your attention. I look forward to what you build next.
Thanks again, Anna. And Anna will be back with another presentation after lunch on data communication methods for embedded systems. So it's lunchtime. We're a touch behind schedule, but we'll take 50 minutes for lunch. So we'll come back at 1:25 p.m. and try to get started there. We've got a little bit of a buffer in the agenda after afternoon tea anyway, so we should still finish on time, no problem. So I won't take up any more time with housekeeping now. We can go enjoy the lunch. So see you back in 50 minutes and see you outside.